Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so our screencast for today is going to focus on how President Herbert Hoover responded to the Great Depression. So really this is a problem that Hoover kind of inherits. So he's only been the president at this point when the Great Depression breaks out for really only about 7 to 8 months. So a lot of the underlying problems we talked about in the 20s, Hoover kind of jumps in and he assumes the presidency in 1929 and kind of inherits this huge crisis that kind of develops right away in his presidency. And so, as we kind of discussed, the early depression is very severe. The stock market crashes, you have bank runs, you have home foreclosures, you have huge unemployment, at least 25% unemployment. Another 25% of the workforce is either underemployed or working part-time, can't get enough hours. So Hoover really, he inherits a major crisis, really not foreseen before in the future, or excuse me, in the past in the United States. So what he's going to do and how he reacts, we really have to talk a little bit about and see, like, what do you think about his response? Do you think he should be blamed for the severity of the Great Depression, the prolonged nature of the Great Depression? So like we talked about in the past screencast, a lot of these makeshift like shantytown villages that are popping up, they start to be named after the president. They start calling them Hoovervilles. Now, so what we have to kind of think about is, do you think that Hoover deserves the blame for the severity of the Depression? You can't blame him really for the stock market crash and what happened initially, but we can kind of critique his reaction to it. So I want you guys to think about this question as we go through the screencast. Is Herbert Hoover to blame for the severity of the Great Depression? Do you think it's kind of like unwarranted, the blame that Hoover gets? So we're going to kind of like take a look at it and see like what did Hoover do, what did he not do, and see like how do you feel about his reaction. So we're really going to focus mostly on Hoover, almost exclusively on Hoover's response today in the screencast. So I want to take a look at a quote from Hoover, and I want you guys to kind of think about what is he trying to say here. So he says, he's talking about the Depression. He says, "We were challenged with a peacetime choice between the American system of rugged individualism and a European philosophy of diametrically opposed doctrines of paternalism and static socialism." So what does he mean here? What is he talking about? So first of all, let's look at what is he talking about here with rugged individualism. So he's saying, like, listen, we have an American system built off of this idea, this concept that you as an American, you make your own fate in the United States. That you can go from having very little to having a great middle class life or even a wealthy life. And our system is kind of one that you kind of rely on yourself and maybe your community for your success. So he's saying, like, listen, we have this choice. We can keep our American system of capitalism, of rugged individualism, of the economic system we've had, or we can kind of go the way that the Europeans are going in the response to the Great Depression. One thing you want to remember, the Great Depression is not just an American phenomenon. Our economy is linked to the European economies, to economies around the world. So when the American stock market crashes and our economy crashes, so do the Europeans' economies. And the Europeans, some countries take very different approaches to it. You have two rising philosophies in the world at the time, and they're going to offer very different approaches to dealing with the Depression. One of them, the one he calls this idea of paternalism and static socialism. Really what he's talking about here are two major, I won't call them economic systems, but political systems that are intertwined with economic systems that develop in the time period, which is the philosophy of communism, or the ideology of communism, and the ideology of fascism. So in Europe, you have fascism taking over, you have communism taking over, so you have Mussolini in Italy, you have Hitler taking over in Germany, you have fascism rising in Spain, you have communism in the Soviet Union, potentially spreading, and there's kind of like civil wars breaking out in certain European areas between socialists and communists, most notably in Spain. But you have these other potential like solutions to it. So what's interesting about our reaction as Americans to the Great Depression, if you go back to the quote from Hoover, we very much, to a large extent, stick with our ideas and our system. America never seriously entertains a revolution, a change of like to communism, a change to fascism. We do take elements of socialism, and you're going to see a lot of that in FDR's approach to dealing with the Great Depression. But we never really kind of like have this entertain this idea of a revolution in response to the Depression. So I want you guys to kind of keep that in mind, that we don't kind of go away the way that a lot of European countries go in the wake of the Great Depression. Now, what does Hoover actually do? And this is very important to understand. The first thing I want you guys to kind of just take note of. A lot of people will make the statement that Hoover did nothing in response to the Great Depression. Now, that is patently false. So you want to make sure that you understand that Hoover does have a response. He doesn't just sit there and do nothing in response to the Great Depression. People may be very critical of the way that Hoover responds, but he doesn't do nothing. Okay, so you have to understand that Hoover takes an approach, and we have to understand his philosophy towards it. It's very much in line with this system of rugged individualism, this idea of American philosophy. And it's also very much in line with what we've learned about Hoover before he became the president. So Hoover's the president from 1929 until 1933. He's a one-term president. Now, we learned about him during World War I. And if you remember, this propaganda poster might jog your memory. Herbert Hoover is in charge of what's called the Food Administration during World War I. And the Food Administration, their job was essentially to try and convince Americans to save food for the war effort, to go without certain products so that the soldiers could have as much as they needed. So Hoover kind of takes what he learned during the Food Administration, trying to lay that out for World War I, and apply it to this new crisis of the Great Depression. So his approach is largely going to be the same ideology. He's going to try and institute this idea of volunteerism throughout the United States. He believes in American patriotism, Americans willing to sacrifice and do for their fellow countrymen. So he believes that he's going to try and attack the Great Depression with a spirit of volunteerism. He wants things to be done on the local level through voluntary organizations, voluntary means, and on the state level. So like the state government and private organizations. So that's a very important element to kind of understand here with Hoover, is that he doesn't really want a lot of mandates coming from the federal government. He wants the people to voluntarily donate and try and help through organizations. He wants the local governments to be more involved and provide aid to the people. He doesn't want a lot coming from the federal government. So one thing you want to understand here, you can see a lot of traditional American philosophies here, right? He's fearful of a federal government that's too big and too expansive, right? Too powerful. So he wants the local governments to kind of like take control over like providing relief and aid and different things to the people. Again, privatization. He wants private companies, local charities, local churches to provide a lot of the things that are needed for the people. Okay, so he's not really super willing for the federal government to step in and play a tremendous role in providing aid to the people. He'd rather local organizations, local charities, local churches, and even the local government do much more than the federal government's doing. And that's a very traditional American viewpoint of the role of the federal government. They don't want it to be too big. They don't want it to be too expansive. Think back to country ideology from the Founding Fathers generation and the American Revolution. There's still a fearfulness of the federal government becoming too powerful and expanding with too much influence over the people's lives. So that's the number one thing you want to write down, that he believes in the spirit of volunteerism, local charities, local groups, kind of bearing the brunt of trying to help people during the Depression. Now, the second thing that he kind of like does to try and stem the tide of the Depression is to get businesses to make pledges to the federal government. Now, what do we mean by pledges? What he wants these companies to do is to pledge to not lay workers off and to not cut workers' hours. So essentially, these are not legal agreements. He wants them to make these pledges basically like agreements of kind of just like honor, that they will not lay off a certain number of workers, or they will not cut workers' hours. Now, a lot of businesses step up and do make these pledges. They do make these pledges that they're not going to cut workers. They're not going to kind of lay people off. Now, the important thing to understand here is that even though they make these pledges, remember, they're not legally binding pledges. And so therefore, a lot of them do go back on their word. after things get even more difficult and more difficult. Hoover was of the mindset that there is nothing really flawed with the US economy itself, that it's just like a natural downturn in the economy and maybe a more severe one than we're used to, but it will bounce back up and rebound. So essentially, these businesses were thinking about maybe more of a short-term problem that they could kind of stem off, and potentially like their companies are going to rise back up and expand and be able to keep employing these people. So like, again, this is a voluntary system, right? The companies didn't have to. They could make these pledges. They didn't have to make these pledges in order to keep people on the workforce. So that's his second thing, this idea of company pledges. Now, if you look at this, some companies do okay during the Depression. So like Ford actually raised his wages for his workers during the Depression. He gets companies to make commitments to make new construction and $1.8 billion of new construction. The third thing I will put down is that he does kind of offer a tax cut to individuals throughout the country. And so like, this is another thing that we kind of talked about, this idea of giving tax cuts in order to stimulate the economy. And so you see this in the current administration. The Trump administration has used tax cuts to try and stimulate the economy. And this goes back from Mellon's philosophy laid out in the 1920s, which Republicans are going to kind of gravitate to. So Hoover gravitates to it, Ronald Reagan later in the 1980s, Donald Trump now in our current era, George Bush, kind of all believe in this philosophy of tax cuts can help grow the economy, because when you get a tax cut, potentially as a business owner, you might invest that back into your business. So he passes these tax cuts to try and stimulate growth back into the economy. He even gets governors on the local level to expand their public works projects and to do more public works. Now, the most famous public works project that's done under Hoover, so the federal government does get involved in some public works and kind of begrudgingly, but they do create this dam called the Hoover Dam, which is a massive damming of a river out in the western part of the United States, the Colorado River. So this is, a huge project that is undergone. And so like they do kind of provide some employment, although Hoover is very reluctant to do things like this on a mass scale. Now, the one thing that Hoover is not really willing to do is he's not really willing to provide direct relief to the people in the forms of like checks given by the federal government to the American people. So like that he's not willing to do. Now, when you look at like Hoover's response as a whole, it's very interesting because we're going through a time period now with a major economic crisis happening due to the coronavirus. And if you've been paying attention to what the federal government is doing, the federal government is providing a ton of direct relief. So they're currently kind of, implementing these different bills. They're trying to provide about between $1 to $2 trillion of relief in all different fashions, from like actually just giving checks of about $1,000 to Americans right in their bank account, to like putting mortgage payments on hold, providing direct relief to industries that are struggling, trying to help small businesses. So like this is a huge part of the Trump administration's approach to dealing with this current economic crisis. So you can kind of see comparisons. We've learned a lot from the Great Depression about how you deal with an economic crisis. And so like some of these ideas that Hoover puts out there, the philosophy about it has changed dramatically over time. A lot of people wanted direct relief in the era, and Hoover is not really willing to give it. So the most famous example of this is this group of veterans from World War I. They refer to them as the bonus army because they wanted their World War I bonuses early as a way to help them during the Depression. And this really, I think, hurts Hoover's chances of getting reelected in 1932, because Hoover is going to call in the police and call in the federal government troops to try and like stop this bonus army from like rioting. And this caused all kinds of horrible headlines for the Hoover administration. And so this really, I think, hurts his election chances in 1932 against FDR. So we're going to kind of leave it off there. This kind of gives you a good broad picture of what Hoover tries to do in response to the Great Depression. What I want you guys to keep in mind, number one, do you think the way he responds is enough? Is this a reason to blame him for the severity of the Depression? The second thing you want to keep in mind is we're going to talk about FDR next, and can you compare Hoover's and FDR's approach to the Depression?